So a bit of an introduction to myself. My name is Rob Johnson. I'm a sales director at Lighthouse. I've been in legal technology for about 15 years now. I look old, but I'm actually only 34. And yeah, so I've been in the e-discovery space for over 5 years now, so worked a whole host of technology providers, understanding the differences between self-service and full managed service, and being the sales side of that. And Natalie?
Hi, my name is Natalie Beckles. I've obviously worked for Lighthouse. I am the Customer Success Manager for Spectra, which is a self-service e-discovery tool. My background is I worked for 7 years for Hogan Lovells and Skadden in a litigation department, and then moved over to legal tech to kind of like hone my skills on the technical side of expertise, and then move over to a more consultative role. And that's my position now at Lighthouse.
Thanks, Natalie. So the topic of our discussion today is why law firms and companies have moved away from outsourcing e-discovery services. Now, e-discovery is a pure microcosm of the, I suppose the evolution of technology we've seen over the last 20 years. And it's a true reflection on where technology has come and where it is now. So as part of this discussion, we thought it'd be a good idea to start with where we've come from, to where we are now, to where we perhaps see things going in the future. So, like all good lawyers, right, trying to get you guys to onboard and buy into technology has always been a challenge, right? So I remember the first time that I got involved in selling technology, I had to try and sell AI to a guy who still printed off his emails. So if that is the most challenging thing you have to do in your life, then that's a tricky thing. So traditionally, obviously, e-discovery or e-disclosure used to be printing, manually redacting, manual review, really expensive process, really arduous, took a long time, no one wanted to do it. We saw the birth of technology, so e-disclosure services, so things like relativity, kind of 15 years ago, and we saw a slow introduction to technology. Now, the challenge we saw was that these things were really expensive. So to do anything from an e-discovery perspective, it had to be warranted. So it would have to be a multi-billion-dollar investigation or a cross-border antitrust issue. So you wouldn't use these technologies for in-house or internal investigations. Is that generally what you saw as well, Natalie?
Yeah, I think there's, obviously, the landscape has been changing for some time, and obviously the growth of data is exponential. And basically, from the flip of being a lawyer, trying to get to the heart of information as quickly as possible in the most cost-effective way is always at the kind of forefront of your mind. And I think that's kind of brings us to where we are now, and why you're seeing vendors who, traditional model was to always have, the e-disclosure service sit within the vendor itself. And I think as kind of lawyers, investigations, not just litigation, but, compliance, regulatory, general investigations, stuff before claim, or just trying to arm your client with the best steps forward, has meant that that landscape of how you handle data and get to the heart of information and evidence has had to change, which means that on the flip of that, as vendors, we've also had to change ourselves, and which is why you're seeing a lot more self-service technologies and self-service model in both our industry and going into in-house and for firms as well, and not just firms, corporations as well.
Yeah, so true. The reality of what we've seen, I suppose, over the last 10 years is that lawyers have traditionally always been kind of skeptical about technology, and fundamentally, when working with their corporate clients, all the client would typically used to see is a huge line item for some expensive e-disclosure or e-discovery, which they've never known or heard about before. And so what we've seen is, as Natalie has alluded to, is with the birth and the incarnation of self-service tools, law firms and corporates have been able to almost charge these services back as a revenue generation part of the business, purely because we've seen a barrier to entry greatly reduce. This is kind of through the birth of things like AWS and Azure and sales, software as a service, so SaaS. So we no longer have to go work in a big Swiss bank and do a huge piece of e-disclosure and it be on premise and it be a really expensive exercise. Nobody wants to do it, no one wants to be there, to a point where for example, like Lighthouse, we can turn on a data center in Switzerland for fractions of the price, and then we can do that project in-house, in-country, for thousands instead of millions. I mean, when you were working for your law firm, what was kind of the general kind of consensus around disclosure?
Going back a bit, so
Yeah.
good 5 years or so. So for that particular firm, they had relativity in-house, and it was something which was decided from the US. So quite interestingly, kind of working in the UK and kind of mainland Europe, the use of e-discovery and e-disclosure services on an everyday is very different. And with that comes the knowledge of how to use that technology. So the firm had a very expensive tool in-house, but never used it. And one of the reasons they never used it was because there was a lack of expertise or understanding of how to apply it. Now, you can teach how to do things, so, follow these steps, 1, 2, 3. But I think the most important thing, and I think it's something that's often forgotten in technology services, is that as lawyers, you don't necessarily want to just know what is the steps, 1, 2, 3. It's why. It's if I perform things in such a way, what are the potential consequences? What am I potentially missing? How does that fit into the efficiency model, and what's the cost impact? And I think that is one of the most kind of key bits of information that is forgotten often in technology. So kind of fast forward into looking at self-service tools which are now being offered, and not really talking just directly at Lighthouse, is that there's a whole plethora of different platforms that are available, and they are mainly based around cost, because cost is so important. But I think where our particular tooling separates itself is that it's a self-service tool which is built on industry standards platforms such as Nuix and Relativity, but to use them is incredibly hard and also hard to teach. So what Spectra is ultimately an automated kind of architecture that sits over those tools, so that you don't need to know the full expertise of how to use Nuix or Relativity, because the steps are automated. Where we see it as a differentiator is that with that, you're not just buying into a self-service tool, you are buying into a wider team, so a level of consultation. So I think often the fear, especially in the UK, is when you bring something in-house and you don't necessarily have a fully tech team in-house, is actually the consequences of your actions and ultimately what you provide, whether that be advice or documents to the other side, or your finalized report. The steps that you've actually undertaken by yourself, it can be quite daunting. So what we've built into our self-service model is that level of consultation. So at no cost as well, so that when you have these types of cases and steps, that you can actually pick up the phone, brainstorm, talk about what you're looking to do, and actually have someone who does it every day advise on maybe a different route, or co-sign exactly the approach, and basically keep that level of education ongoing. So you're not just buying a tool in, you are kind of growing with the industry. So you're learning about that information. And in addition to that, AI being kind of the most pertinent thing in our business, there are so many different things moving around at the moment, is that making sure that your self-service tool has the ability to add those different layers, whether that be with yourself or whether you're out of capacity, being able to actually have another kind of extension of your team, whether that be inside vendors, take that on for you. So it's just been really wise to what the potential red flags you should be looking out for, and what you bring in-house, what are the things, you don't necessarily need to know the technical steps, but what are the things that you need to be really aware of from a consultative perspective to understand the implications of your actions when using those tools in-house?
I think that's a good point. And I think with kind of the birth of self-service tools, as you were talking about, is that we've seen that it's been used for many things that are happening now in the world, right? Because fundamentally, as I mentioned at the beginning, e-discovery tools, traditionally really expensive, so we're saved for the biggest pieces of work. Whereas now what we've seen is kind of with like personal data and PII and DSARs and internal investigations, with the use of self-service tools like Spectra, it's given in-house teams effectively the ability to run these processes in-house. So traditionally, for example, I'm working with a couple of people and they had a data subject access request. They didn't know what to do with it. They're limited on time. And so they pushed it out to a big tier law firm, and it cost them $75,000 to do that one DSAR. And so we had a discussion with them around, okay, what do you want to try and solve? And it's like, well, we kind of want to use technology, but we've used it on a piece of litigation before, it costs a lot of money. How can you help, right? And so fundamentally, that's where that self-service element comes into hand. It's because they are able to quickly scale up their, I suppose, capabilities in-house by leveraging effectively market-leading technologies at a fraction of the price, be able to do these things in-house, get competent in that process. But if things get too big, or that DSAR perhaps goes into an internal investigation or kind of grows, then they have the ability to kind of effectively throw it over the fence. And that's where we saw, and where we see that kind of bell curve of competency with technologies is kind of the birth of self-service technologies. So we have a lot of proprietary tools out there. You have things like us, but you also have the ability for in-house teams to do this internally. I mean, Natalie, when you're speaking to, I suppose, law firms from an in-house perspective, I mean, from a self-service perspective, what's kind of the main things that they're looking for when it comes to these type of tools, do you think?
I think always cost efficiencies. I think with self-service tools that are coming from vendors, you're not having to maintain security and maintain the actual tools themselves. So, you know, that cost element is completely gone away. In addition to that, traditionally with e-discovery services, the first thing is processing fees, which are large. It's the big item before data even hits a platform where you can actually start looking for the information that's required. So I think Spectra is kind of developed as an e-discovery tool, but what we're really seeing clients, and not just firms, but corporations use these self-service tools is not actually as a way to kind of talk about, you know, e-disclosure to their end clients. It's actually often when they just bring in on their new clients and actually advising on potentially what claims are available. We're seeing firms in the Netherlands actually take the data in and just do a first-class assessment, not at a charge to the end client, because the cost of running these tools is so low. You have the ability to actually look at documents, the metadata, so the actual content of the documents, whether that be for searching, keywords, or even just physically reading the actual information in a document at such a lower size. So if you can imagine, if you've got 100 gigabytes of natives, if you just looked at the metadata from the text, that's, for example, 30 gigabytes, so it's 30% of the size. But the key information is in actually the text itself, not the natives. So what we're seeing is a lot of companies, as well as firms, use these self-service tools just to arm them with the information of what they're going to advise their client before they even get to claim stages. And I think that really sets you apart from other firms if you are, you know, when you're tendering for work, that you haven't even got that massive kind of e-disclosure bottom line cost. But also it sets you, you know, apart because you can actually get to the nitty-gritty of the information, often what is provided by the end client versus what you actually see in the documentation can be quite different. So yeah, going back to your question, the first point is always cost. The second point is how quickly can I get to the information I need? So you've still got a very, very powerful processing tool which sits on industry standard processing UX and relativity. And I think the key kind of sweetener is that, you know, something that can be quite small, whether that be 1 gigabyte, 2 gigabytes, small amount of data, which you may just be using just to inform the client on how you're going to approach that particular case, actually can still, all that information is still stored and actually can be, you know, utilized later on when you move forward with the claim and actually get further data, and it's still, once again, sitting in your remit, it's in your control of the firm or the corporation, and you're not beholden to these kind of massive large line items to kind of get to the crucial information that you need.
I think it's important. I think fundamentally with all these type of processes, and to leave people with something, is that I think long gone has the day where you effectively have 200,000 documents to manually review. So if you ever get yourself into that position, you need to be working with a provider who can constantly look for technology and efficiencies for driving that process. Because fundamentally, a lot of e-discovery providers, they want the doc review, right? Because it generates a lot of revenue. So how the best way to think about these is, what kind of technologies can we use, put in place? As Natalie said, can we leverage a self-service tool as almost like an ECA, right? So an early case assessment. So previously, a lot of the issues is, I've seen lawyers kind of take a PSE file, so an email, drop it into their own email account, then review those emails, but effectively, fundamentally, you're changing the metadata. So the data that sits behind the email, so your defensible position on those emails is changed. And so people have been doing that fundamentally because of the cost incurred of running a relativity process. So if you can bring some sort of self-service tool in-house to have a poke around, right? See what is actually going on, get a bit of context around the case, and then move it to something a bit bigger, then great. And then fundamentally is look to your technology provider to take you on that journey around things like AI, right? AI is it's a term that's used for pretty much anything, right? But fundamentally, it's a great process for how can we take this big corpus of data and get it down to a manageable size from a proportionality perspective, right? So instead of us having to review 200,000 documents, it's going to cost £500,000, right? Can we move it down to a place where we're actually reviewing 10,000 documents? And how can technology consistently get us to a point where we're only reviewing the only relevant information within that? I don't know if you've got anything to add to that.
Yeah, I think, so if I was working in-house now, what would I be looking at when looking at self-service tools? My first port of call would be to have a level of education available. And a level of education that's available not because I've had to hire a technologist in-house, but that's available as part of the service. The second part would be that, with that education, have someone who's consultative. So, for example, if you are starting, let's think about a bigger case rather than small sets of data, where you've got, say, I don't know, a terabyte of data, a lot of vendors would say process the data first and then do various searches to kind of minimize that. Whereas our approach is actually, let's go back to collection. What are you collecting? Why are you collecting in such a way? What's the data retention policies and so forth? We have a massive advisory background as well, which kind of comes into play as well. So just even having that consultative part, rather than just if you have a self-service tool without that consultation around, you would just go down the route of just processing the data, which ultimately will still have a large cost, even if you were just looking at metadata and text. So for me, the key thing is a self-service tool which is reputable, has some industry standing, which is coming at a very cost-effective level, but consultation available at no cost, and education that stays. So not just from the point that you buy into the tool, and education that your vendor is with you the whole journey of the way, providing you up-to-date information, and also letting you know what's coming in the pipeline. So you may not necessarily be interested in using that type of AI technology, but arming you with the information about what's in the pipe. I remember the days of when, my first e-discovery project, and was talking about keywords and narrowing the keywords so much so in a complex way to actually make sure the data sets were so much smaller, and actually trying to get parties on side was difficult just with that approach. And lo and behold, read the articles about predictive coding and actually how it could be so much more accurate than a human, because it's scary. It's things that's so out of the unknown. And kind of roll it forward 10, 12 years, predictive coding is still debated a lot, especially when you go into other sides. But there's actually this whole other layer of artificial technology, which is coming about. But just having that information at the forefront of your mind and kind of growing with your vendor to kind of build out that self-service model in the firm, I think is really important.
I don't know if there's any questions, but I think that kind of covers everything that we wanted to discuss today.
Shout.
On my way.
Thanks very much. Yeah. Good afternoon. I'm really interested in this space because it's a space that I'm currently in as well. And I think what resonates from this morning's initial sort of speakers and now is that there's a distinct lack of probably trust and transparency within process and technology, which we're trying to impact as we go along. I suppose a question for yourself first, Natalie, because it's interesting that you touch on the why, and I don't think often people do in the technology space. They often focus on the how and the what. I'd just be keen to know, because customer success is also something that we're building out in our functions. And I'd be just keen to know from yourself, you know, within the learnings and teachings that you found within customer success, in your customer success role, sorry, what do you think has specifically impacted change, would you say, significantly with law firms, UK, globally?
Good question. I think the one thing that I'm so aware of is that actually where the customer or where your client is on that journey of learning is often so different. So, for example, you can have a large firm who wants to bring self-service tool in-house because financially it makes sense. So you may sell, for example, to a partner, but ultimately the individuals that are actually going to be doing the everyday work may not be privy to these conversations. So a case will land on their table, and now they may be involved in trying to understand why you would search or batch in a certain way to get them to where they need to be, which is actually some of their associates doing the first level review and then second level review and so forth. So the challenge I've often found is actually lawyers that don't have much time on their hands often just want to get to the point of, okay, tell me what I need to do X, Y, and Z so we can get the review started. And with the flip of it being self-service, and actually the onus is on the firms or the corporations to actually undertake the work, it's arming them with the information of, okay, you may want to do X, Y, and Z because it's the quickest route, or it seems like the quickest route. But are you aware of the potential areas where certain documents won't be in your review or might be left out? And why is that important? Well, initially it might not seem important because actually you've got the smallest document set, which obviously you're going to get through the review quicker and get to a point of disclosure or whatever that might be, informing your kind of witness statement interviews and so forth. So actually trying to educate someone as to sometimes a shortcut isn't the best cut is the hardest. So with that is, I think you have to earn trust. So you can always point out the caveats, understand that it's a self-service tool, and actually as vendors you're most definitely not in the driving seat, but you're just giving information. And I think trying to create a workflow which compromises on certain aspects, but making sure that your client still gets to where they need to be is the most important part, because what you're trying to do is build a journey with the tool, journey with the trust, and you know, it's the same for myself. When I used to work at a firm, I didn't really understand the whys around it, but I did know what my deadlines are and what I needed to get to. And I think flipping on the other side of that and then the technical aspect really gives you that armoured information. So for me, what is key when someone has a tool self-service in-house is trying to get that information to them as quick as possible in a way that they understand, in a way that they can use that, whether that be with discussions with their senior associate partners above and or the end clients. And yeah, it's a journey.
I think just to add a team bit to that as well, so from like my commercial side is transparency as well. Like I think there's there you go. Is transparency. So if you're working with partners or a firm that perhaps don't come across this every day, like e-discovery can be like, oh, we're throwing data into a box and it's going to give us something to do on the other end. And so to provide it, as Natalie has said, like that education piece, but cost is always a driver. And so if we're, from the sales perspective, aren't being transparent about where they are in their costings, you're always going to get into trouble, right? And so, because I've been there, everyone's been there, right? Like, they get an invoice sent and they're like, whoa, how have we got to this being this much? And it's because there's been a lack of transparency and communication between the provider, so Lighthouse in the example, and the client. And so for us, it's fundamentally is to provide them that journey on how they can get to success, but to let them know and fully understand the costings around that process. Because like, I'm a big believer in being as transparent as possible, and so if you're going to be like, okay, if you do this, it's going to cost X amount, and give them those options. So always remain transparent throughout the process would be my recommendation.
Great, thank you.
Hi, good afternoon. One of the topics that's been discussed quite a lot at this conference is with regards to cybersecurity. And obviously a big area is exfiltrated data. And I'm interested to understand how a self-service e-discovery tool can add value to organizations that suffer such, I guess, attack, and how that works with serious volumes of data.
I mean, I can start if that helps. I think fundamentally, when it comes to serious volumes of data, is a majority of the clients that certainly we work with are, for example, M365 or something similar, or have moved to the cloud. And so it's all around, so the e-discovery reference model is about how can you minimize that data volume upstream, right, fundamentally. And so e-discovery or e-disclosure is a transactional event that has to happen downstream. So what a lot of the work we do, and a good provider will help you get into a position where you're actually minimizing that data up front. So for example, we're working with a big oil and gas company at the moment, and we're in discussions around their data retention and defensible disposal processes, because those organizations, on the face of it, may be very competent, but actually if you look under the hood, there's a mess, right? And so what you need to get them to a position is that they kind of, for example, they had to process 17 years of data, for example, right? And so they should never be in a position where they have to process that volume of information. And so a good consultative provider will help them get into a position up front where they're like, actually, what are your processes for retaining information? Now, some things you'll always have to hold on to, right? But some things you can delete as long as you've got a defensible position around it, you can get rid of that information. So from our position, it's always thinking about, like, how can you mitigate your volumes, right, fundamentally? And that's by doing upstream consultative work around what are your processes, how are you holding data, are you deleting data when you should be? And that obviously minimizes your overall risk as well, right? So, for example, I've worked with a couple of financial institutions, and they just have big data centers in their basements where they've lost the keys to, right? And so effectively they have a ticking time bomb of data. So it's to try and mitigate that issue as much as possible. I don't know if you've got anything to add to that.
No, it's good.
Thank you.
No worries. Anyone else? I think that's it. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for listening.